of finding solutions to the challenges we face. And there's no greater challenge in this region than food insecurity. Thank you for your commitment, and I look forward to our discussion this morning. Thank you very much.
I'm sure we can do better with our hands. Another round of applause for... Thank you so much for setting the pace or laying the ground for what is going to be a very engaging conversation. Dr. Gulaid Artan, Director, IGAD, Climate Prediction and Applications Center. And now, ladies and gentlemen, allow me invite Mr. Stephen Wathome, who is the Program Manager at the European Union Delegation to Kenya, to come make his remarks as well. A round of applause for him.
Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Okay, I'm here on behalf of the EU, and it's an honor to join you today as we continue to grapple with one of the world's most urgent issues, which is hunger. The 2023 Global Food Crisis Report gives us an even fuller picture of the global hunger than prior editions. And unfortunately, the numbers, like we also had just now, are alarming. 7 countries are facing situations close to famine. 35 million people are on the brink of starvation, and 258 million people are experiencing an acute food and nutrition crisis and require urgent support. Now just think about that last number for a moment. 258 million people. That's more than half the entire population of the European Union. So you can see we are talking about numbers here which are quite alarming. Now the food crisis has reached truly terrifying proportions. And for many years, we have recognized conflict, insecurity, and climate challenges as the main drivers of food insecurity. This year, economic vulnerability takes prominence. And countries with limited fiscal space and high debt simply cannot withstand global economic shocks triggered by events such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine and COVID-19. The sustained disruption of value chains, soaring food and energy prices, and record inflation are just too much to absorb. This is yet another indication of the need for comprehensive action to address both acute food emergencies and the long-term drivers of hunger. The kind of solutions that the Global Network Against Food Crisis calls for. And this is what we must keep up with. Now the EU has reacted swiftly to respond to the global food crisis through a combination of humanitarian, development, and trade actions. And for example, our solidarity lanes have contributed to a drop in food prices at global levels. But in many countries, high domestic food inflation remains. We must find sustainable medium and long-term solutions to food and nutrition security challenges. This means promoting sustainable and resilient food systems, supporting our partner countries, strategic autonomy, and advancing the humanitarian development peace nexus approach. And together with our member states, we have mobilized more than 18 billion euros to help partner countries address their global food crisis until 2024, which is next year. We have already disbursed almost 7 billion euros for just 2022. And we have launched targeted initiatives to boost local food production and decrease dependence on unsustainable imports. We actively support the Africa Free Continental Trade Area to enhance intra-regional agri-food trade. And of course, we continue to work multilaterally to accelerate the pace of progress, just as we aim to do today. Distinguished guests, in the coming months, we will gather to take stock of progress on food systems, transformation, and on Agenda 2030 at large. Given the scale and severity of the global food crisis, we are indeed called to act. We are indeed called to dig deeper than ever before, to collaborate like never before, and to renew our global commitment to zero hunger. The world has reached the crucial midpoint in implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We will either fail or succeed in this endeavor together. And finally, let me just mention that it is good. This report is quite good, and in the future, it would also be useful if we can spread and enhance data collection from a wider range of partners so that we can have more and more reliable and concrete information. So that's all I had for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stephen Wathome, Program Manager at the EU delegation to Kenya, and for sharing those statistics with us. 35 million people are on the brink of starvation. If you're going to look at this number in terms of what our East African or IGAD country populations look like, I think if we put all these people into one country, they probably would fit into a country like Rwanda and almost fill up a country like Uganda. And if you look at what these populations really go through on a day-to-day, especially those who fall in the category of acute food insecurity, there's so much that comes to mind in terms of how long we're going to take before we can say we have comfortably mitigated the situation. So it's now time for us to get to know exactly why we need to understand these numbers, and this is through the global report on the food crises. And so I'm going to invite Ms. Sarah McHattie, who is the Global Coordinator, Food Security Information Network, who will make a presentation, and then followed by Dr. Abdi Fidar, who is the Coordinator for IGAD Food Security, Nutrition, and Resilience Analysis Hub, who are going to make a presentation on the regional focus on IGAD member states. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's put our hands together for Ms. Sarah McHattie. Round of applause for her.
Good morning, everyone. Tech team in the back, can we put on the presentation? So, ladies and gentlemen and dignitaries here in the room and also online, good morning again. It's a pleasure to be here. I think it's actually the first time I've given a presentation in person since COVID. So it's really a pleasure to be here to present the 2023 Global Report on Food Crisis. So what I'll be talking about is the report that was released in May, which gives the global overview of food insecurity before we do a deep dive into the IGAD regional report. So The GRFC is a global public good. It is the reference document on acute food insecurity in 2022, so last year's acute food insecurity, and covers 58 countries. It's developed through partnership, so 16 partners, no less than 16 partners, contributed to the development of the report, which is facilitated by the FSIN. It's based on data, and the numbers that we present are the consensus figures of peak numbers of people in urgent need of food assistance. So this means for every year, for 2022, in each of the 58 countries, what was the highest number of people that faced food insecurity? The GRFC is also a suite of products. So we released the GRFC, the global GRFC, in May actually just last month. Here we have the pleasure today to be supporting the launch of the IGAD regional focus. We're flying to Abuja to launch on Friday the Rapport Régional sur le Sahel et l'Afrique de l'Ouest, which is a new regional focus for the GRFC. And then in September, we'll also publish a mid-year update. So there's two things to remember as I make this presentation. Firstly, this presentation is on data. So I'm going to talk to you about the numbers and the figures that we've analyzed and presented. But we also have to remember that every number that we discuss, every number that will be presented in the next report, is a person, is part of a family, is part of a community. And these reports are for them. These are tools to provide evidence so that we can better address their needs. So what is the number? Almost 250 million people in 58 countries face high levels of acute food insecurity. These people require urgent food, nutrition, and livelihood assistance. For 180 million of them, we're able to break down the severity and the depth of the food insecurity because of the data that we have. So 144 million people are in crisis, which means they face food gaps. 35 million people are in emergency, which means they face very large food gaps. And to fill those food gaps, they have to sell their houses, their land, or their breeding animals, which compromises their futures. And 380 million people were in catastrophe. This means this is a situation where they're in starvation, they face an extreme lack of food, as well as destitution. Another 80 million people in 17 countries we know were acutely food insecure or highly acutely food insecure and also required assistance, although we can't break down the severity because of the analysis that they're based on. But another thing that we can't forget, and here we'll find probably the total population is more than that of the European Union, is here this number of 258 million are people who are highly food insecure, in urgent need of assistance. There's an additional 253 million people that face stressed acute food insecurity. So these are people who struggle to feed themselves every day. And to be able to feed themselves every day, they may have to make a decision between, today do I eat or do I go to the hospital? They may pull their children from school to be able to cover their food needs. So in total, we're facing almost 500 million people in the world facing acute food insecurity. So where are these people? So there's three messages in the next slides that I'll present. The first one is that the GRFC only covers a subset of countries. So 73 countries were long listed for analysis in 2023. This means they faced an acute shock or they requested assistance because of the situation in their country. So they requested international food assistance. 58 of these countries had data sources that complied with the GRFC. An additional 15 were identified as potentially having acutely food insecure populations, but we didn't have the data to be able to analyze them under the GRFC framework. So this means we know that there are more people out there who are acutely food insecure. And when you speak about acute food insecurity, we speak both of the magnitude, which is the numbers of people who are food insecure, but also the prevalence. Because if you're in a small country such as Haiti, you might not have high numbers, but you might see a population that faces, a majority of a population or a significant proportion of them who face acute food insecurity. So where are these people? Here we have a map of the magnitude of people facing, so the highest numbers of people facing acute food insecurity. Obviously, the darker countries are the places where there are more people who face acute food insecurity, and we definitely see a concentration on the continent of Africa. I also want to draw your attention, although I realize the presentation is very small, to South America, where you see many countries in gray, and also through Asia. These are countries where we know there's food insecure people, but didn't have sufficient data to include them into the GRFC. When you look at the prevalence, so again, the proportion of the population that faces food insecurity, here you see a slightly different picture. The continent of Africa still is there as having a high prevalence, but here you start to see the Haitis and the South Sudans that come up because of high prevalence. So which countries are the most affected by food insecurity around the world? If you look at the magnitude, this is a list of the 10 largest food crises in terms of the number of people who are affected by food insecurity. Many of the countries in this list continuously come up in the GRFC, mostly because of protracted conflict. DRC, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, Yemen, Nigeria, Syria. But this year we see a few new countries. Ukraine, because of the exacerbation of the conflict there. And also we included Myanmar this year because we finally had an analysis that could be included in the GRFC. But as I said, the proportion of the population that's affected is also an important figure to understand. And here we see, in terms of prevalence, we would add South Sudan to the list of largest food crisis, with 63% of the population in urgent need of humanitarian food assistance. Haiti and Central African Republic as well, with almost half the population requiring humanitarian assistance. We also wanted to draw your attention to the number of people who face catastrophe. Remember, catastrophe is the most severe and extreme form of food insecurity. Famine is declared when at least 20% of a population in a certain area face catastrophe. In 2022, an additional 4 countries had populations in this phase. Somalia represents about 2/3 of the population facing catastrophe. South Sudan, Yemen, Afghanistan are also included. Haiti, for the first time, the first case of catastrophe in the Western Hemisphere, and then also Nigeria and Burkina Faso had populations in catastrophe in West Africa. Now, what's the historical trend that the global report reports on? So this rather complicated graph actually has three key messages. So the GRFC has been reporting on acute food insecurity since 2016. And what we see is that every year, even though we analyze different countries, different numbers of countries, this is whether or not they experienced a shock, whether we have available data to be able to report on, we're nonetheless seeing that the number of people facing high levels of acute food insecurity has increased and is increasing. What we also see, if you look at I think it comes out as green or yellow, when you add the yellow and the orange bars, this is the number of the analyzed population. So it's important to also recognize that since 2020, we're getting better at analyzing populations that could be affected by food insecurity. But nonetheless, since 2018, we've seen a more than doubling in the population at the global level facing high levels of acute food insecurity. So in 5 years, the number of people has doubled. Now, what's driving this? We know that drivers of acute food insecurity are complicated, they're interrelated, they're mutually reinforcing. The partners of the GRFC try every year to analyze what's the main source of food security, the main driver for each country. So this is what we saw for 2022. So one of the conclusions to draw from this donut are that conflict was the main driver for more people and has consistently been the main driver of acute food insecurity globally, affecting almost 118 million people. But this year, as another speaker also noted, economic shocks affected more countries. And this is a really important and new shift. This is based on the 2 years of the socioeconomic effects of COVID-19, and then on top of that came the war in Ukraine. We're seeing economic trends such as global food prices, even though they decreased since March 2022. So in March 2022, they reached an all-time high because of the effects of COVID, because of the effects of the war in Ukraine. And even though they're going down at the global level, this is not translating at the domestic level. So every single country included in the GRFC faced increases in food prices, and more than half of them faced an increase by 10% of the food prices at the national level. But then we also see that even if a smaller number of countries had climate or weather extremes as a main driver, there was nonetheless a doubling in the number of the people affected by weather extremes. This was largely driven by the floods in Pakistan, but also the stubborn La Nina that really exacerbated the drought in the Horn of Africa. The GRFC also touches on displacement and also malnutrition. So one of the reasons why we include these two things in our report is because displacement crises tend to mirror food crises. Displacement is a driver and an outcome of food insecurity, but you can also flip it around and say that food insecurity is a driver and an outcome of displacement. So what we saw was 53.2 million IDPs in 25 food crisis countries. This is an increase of over 6 million since the year before, since 2021. 80% of these people are found in 9 in 10 of the largest food crises. So there we definitely see the link. 19.7 million refugees and asylum seekers were found in 55 countries. Again, this is an increase since 2021 of 4.4 million people. 7 on 10 of these people, 7 on 10 of these almost 20 million people who need international protection because they're refugees or because they're asylum seekers, come from only 5 food crisis countries: Syria, Venezuela, Ukraine, Afghanistan, and South Sudan. In terms of malnutrition, while there isn't a direct linear relationship between malnutrition and food insecurity, certainly high levels of acute food insecurity tend to overlay with very high levels of child wasting. So in the 30 countries for which there was data, because we know as well that nutrition data is difficult to obtain, that over 35 million children under 5 were wasted, of whom 9.2 million were severely wasted. This is the most acute form of acute malnutrition. And again, in the 9 largest food crises, 65% of those children were found. In the next slide, just wanted to show how things break down by region. So the GRFC has 7 regions which we analyze. So in this graph, you can see the share, the magnitude, and the prevalence of high levels of acute food insecurity by the GRFC region. As mentioned earlier, East Africa tops the chart. Almost 57 million people are facing high levels of acute food insecurity. And when you look at the prevalence, that's 1 in 5 of the people in the analyzed population. This is followed by Asia with 51 million people. And you'll note that the prevalence of 36% is very high, but also remember that this includes the Rohingya refugees in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, of whom about 90% are in urgent need of humanitarian assistance. Central and Southern Africa, West Africa, and the MENA region also face high levels of food insecurity. And then LAC and Europe. In the LAC region, remember as well that was where we had the most data gaps, so the most gray countries where we don't have information, but we know that there's a problem there. And while MENA and Europe are new regions for the GRFC, every other region had an increase in food insecurity. So again, we see the numbers and the data saying there's a deterioration. So what are the main challenges to food insecurity in 2023? We know, and we're increasingly realizing and experiencing as individuals and as workers in development and humanitarian worlds, that the drivers of food insecurity are now global and they're relentless. Climate change continues, driving extreme weather events. The global economy, while seems like it might be getting a touch better, is nonetheless still reeling and coping with the effects of COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine. And protracted conflicts continue, and we all experienced how one war in one country now no longer simply can have an effect at the country level or the regional level, but it can have a global effect, as we saw with the war in Ukraine. Specific to 2023, we see, as I said before, that even though international food prices are stabilizing, this is not translating to domestic markets. So we really need to have a better analysis and to recognize that at the country level, households are not able to access food. We see that the resilience of governments is deteriorating. They're affected by high food prices, particularly if you're a net importer, because you have to buy food in US dollars and currencies are depreciating, and incredibly high debt taken on to try and cope with COVID-19. The El Nino officially started last week, and experts say, risks being that 2024 will be the hottest year ever. So we can see continued extreme events. The conflict in Sudan that started a few months ago certainly will have effects in Sudan, but we don't know yet what the regional and global ramifications of that will be. The earthquakes in Turkey and in Syria will certainly have an effect in the MENA region. And one thing to note as well is that even though we had slightly better rains this year in the Horn of Africa, we can't forget that after the worst drought ever, populations will require humanitarian assistance until they can recover their livelihoods. I just wanted to conclude perhaps on a more positive note. So we know that the situation is dire. The Global Report on Food Crisis reports consistently deteriorating food insecurity. Other global reports, such as the Global Report on internal displacement, also records that in the last few years, displacement is on the increase, which means more people are more vulnerable. But we know also that joint action can have impacts. So for example, in 2022, truce in Yemen and scaled-up assistance in Somalia meant that famine did not materialize. That was the joint effort of the international community, a little bit of luck and weather as well. The peace process in Tigray has meant that people have been able to return home and assistance is being provided. Ethiopia is one of the countries in the world where the number of IDPs has actually decreased since 2021. And the Black Sea Grain Initiative, also, this was, again, a multilateral effort. It increased food supplies, and global prices went down on food and fuel and fertilizer. So we know that together we can make a change. So I do think, just to conclude, we're all here, we're listening to the data, we have the evidence, we have the solutions, we have the audience. There's still room for hope and optimism that we can reverse this trend. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that presentation. And now, ladies and gentlemen, allow me invite our next speaker, who is Dr. Abdi Fidar, who is the coordinator, IGAD Food Security, Nutrition, and Resilience Analysis Hub. A round of applause for him.
Good morning. I said earlier, my name is Abdi Fidar, and I coordinate IFRAH, IGAD Food Security and Resilience Analysis Hub. I'm here to show what Sarah said, how that reflects in Horn of Africa region, in the East Africa region. So that's the main reason that we are here now. What we see, out of that 258 million globally, more than 55 are found in the IGAD region. And that represents about more than 20%. Almost, we can say, 1/4 of the global food insecure populations are living in our region. And the region, as Dr. Atta said earlier, is less than 4% of the global population. So less than 4% of the global population represents more than 20% of the food insecure globally. And that's what we see here now. And not only food insecurity, those are the people who are category 3 and above. Those who cannot feed themselves, those who need urgent food aid. Of those 55 million people, more than 300 million are in IPC 5, category 5. They are almost starving. 8.7 million are in grade 4. Those, as said earlier by the moderator, those who are in a very, very dire situation, and more than 20 million are in IPC grade 3. So we see 55 million people And imagine 55 million people both in one country. Those are more than Sudan, South Sudan and Somalia combined, and more than 1/3 of Ethiopia population. It's really very challenging situation. If you put these people together in one country, we have almost a Kenyan population. Those are Kenyans, I think it was more than Kenya's 56 million, I think, this year. So 56 million people. The Kenyan population, those are in need of food aid. Okay, with Idrisi, we said that we have to reduce the number of people those are in need of hunger, in need of food aid. Those who we want as a region to build our resilience. That was the aim. But if you look at here now, from 2016 to 2022, we see how the graph, how the curve is rising. It's not only rising, it's rising actually exponentially. It's exponential now, it's not only rising. If you look at now, 2016, we had, it's less than 17 million, but by 2022, we have 55 million, more than 3 times actually. So that corresponds, again, the growth of population. We need to see that analysis again. Is the population growth and those who are in need of food aid, are they equivalent? We will have to look back. We see now, from 2021, we have 31 million, and now 55 million. More than 12 million people increase. Okay, in Ethiopia, 23 million people are in need of food aid. More than the population of Somalia, 2 times more than the population of South Sudan. And Sudan, it is 11.65. South Sudan, 7, almost 8 million people. 8 million people, almost, of the population of 11 million. Then you can imagine. As Sarah said earlier, the prevalence is shocking. More than 60 million of South Sudan population are in need of food aid. Somalia, 5.5 million. More than 1/3 of the population. More than 1/3 of the population, 17 million people. Uganda, 2.3, Kenya, 4.5, and Djibouti, with a population of about 1 million, almost 200,000 are in need of food aid. It's more than 20% then. We have seen percentage of, from the percentage of Sarah that Ethiopia is one of the, Ethiopia and actually Sudan makes top 10 of the largest population who are in need of food aid globally. So, and then the prevalence, in terms of prevalence, it's South Sudan. 63% of those who are living in South Sudan are in need of food aid. 63%. More, 2/3 of the population are in need of food aid. 2/3 of the population living in that country are in need of food aid. 16.2 million people have been displaced. And that makes statistically more than 5% of the region's population. More than 5% of our population are displaced. Almost 12 million of them internally. So how do we feel when 5%, more than 5% of the population are forced to flee their houses, their homes, their livelihoods? But this is very alarming, really. The good thing is we have representatives of the government of the member states today here. So the main responsibility falls on the governments. Again, malnutrition. Isn't it something that is embarrassing that more than 11 million of our children under 5 are malnutrition? 2.7 of them severely so, in a very dire situation. 2.7 million. And that's 2 times more than the population of Djibouti. It could be 20% of the population of South Sudan. So we need very urgent action, really. What are we expecting next year? 30 million people in 5 countries will be in food aid, in need of food aid. Here, Ethiopia is not included here because Ethiopia, we are using IPC analysis system. So 5 countries, 30 million. If we add this, the figure that may come out from Ethiopia, then it will not be less than 50 million again. And again, we need to remember the situation of Sudan is getting worse. Therefore, the number may even increase. The number of IPC 4 and above, or IPC 5, is estimated to be about 83 million. Now we are reducing that number from 300,000 to 83,000. People are recovering from the droughts then, slowly so. The impact of Sudan may have detrimental impact or implications on food security of the region. Recovery of 3 years of drought may be slower than we would like to be, and El Nino, floods, and transboundary pests may also be the result of this El Nino. So we have to take very urgent action. So thank you. That is what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much for those remarks and sharing the numbers. Indeed, the numbers are quite sad. 11.53 million children currently categorized as wasted, and 30 million people in need of food aid in 5 of the 8 countries under the IGAD member states. That number is quite huge, and I think when we start to look or normalize the numbers in millions, it makes the situation even more dire. So, ladies and gentlemen, allow me invite my panelists to the stage who are going to now talk about the food crisis and also what we need to do to be able to mitigate the effects of these crises. So, let me begin by inviting our very first panelist, Dr. Gulaid Artan. I think he's stepped out for a bit. He'll be joining us in just a short while. Dr. Chimimba David Firi, who is the Sub-Regional Coordinator for Eastern Africa at the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. A round of applause for him as he makes his way to the stage. We also have Mr. Siddharth Krishnaswamy, who is the Head of Research, Analysis and Monitoring at the UN World Food Programme, Regional Bureau for East and Central Africa. Round of applause for him. We have Professor Mohamed Ahmed, who is the Executive Director, OWS Development Fund. Round of applause for him as well. Mr. Amos Nyakeo is the Acting Deputy Director, National Drought Management Authority here in Kenya. A round of applause for him. And I'm going to take the short road to the stage, if you'll allow me to. For those of us who are joining the conversation online, I would like to request us all to send our questions through the chat box or the Q&A section on the Zoom platform, and you'll be able to have them responded to. I can already see there's some questions there regarding the resilience of households, so keep those questions coming through. We're going to have this conversation for about maybe 40 minutes, and then we will go into the Q&A session. And from that point on, we will have our closing remarks right after that. So let me begin maybe by asking the question to all of us as we wait for Dr. Gulate to make his way into the room again. So maybe quickly, I could find out from Mr. Nyakeo in just about a minute. When you look at these numbers in the millions, and knowing that you are under the NDMA here in Kenya, what comes to mind? Do you think we have a solution in the near future, or this is something we really are going to put a lot of effort in? You can use the microphone. Thank you.
Well, thank you. The numbers are mind-boggling, that is for sure. And for me, I would not look at it in terms of whether we are where we can say we can manage this. I want us to look at it in terms of what has been done and what must be done. I think we already know that climate change is real. We know that the frequency of droughts and climate shocks has increased. And because of that, we need now to put our feet down and say we must move in a given direction. And this direction really is putting in place investments that help address the gaps that the climate is not giving us at the moment. One among these is availing investments that will help us harness whatever little water we get. And for your information, this country may seem to be a water deficit country, but that may not be true. The amount of water that we see whenever we have rains, and which all goes to waste, needs to be harnessed and be utilized for food production. And that means that we require to move in a manner that we are able to invest in that, support climate smart production systems, and also leverage on existing technology and new technology that will enable us be food secure as a region, as a continent, as a nation. It is possible, it can be done.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And it's great to have you on the panel as well, Dr. Gulate. And I want to start now officially by posing a question to you, because what we're looking at now, looking at the numbers that have been shared just before we came onto this panel, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia have experienced the worst drought in the last 4 decades. And you know, when we look at the drought situation, these numbers that are being shared, 30 million people in need of food aid, and 11.53 children being categorized as wasted. If you look at the year 2022 alone, we are looking at 55.45 million people who were estimated to be acutely food insecure. These are really mind-boggling numbers, just like Mr. Nyakeo has mentioned. But are these statistics an indicator of a much worse humanitarian crisis or situation if mitigation measures were not put in place?
Yeah, thank you very much. Definitely, yes. If you look at the figures of the death figures that from the famine of 2010-11 that and compared to drought that we had, they are much less. But the question is that are we doing enough? In my opinion, not. To give you an idea, in this region of ours, we had a major drought in 2010, 2011. Then we had another drought 2016, 17. Then the 2020 to 2022. And we have one of the largest area where pastoralism is a way of living. And to restock livestock usually takes around 5 to 6 years. So basically, those pastoralists never got the opportunity of restocking. But if you look at the numbers of, I saw the figures for expenditure on development and humanitarian aid on the last 7-8 years. With your question, you're implying that we have done an investment, increased investment. No, we haven't done. Actually, it's flat. If you look at the investment, it's flat. And with the war in Ukraine, I think it might even go down. The investment that's coming to the region might go down. So definitely there has been an investment in resilience. In my opinion, it has done something, definitely yes, but it's not enough. And we have to think outside of the box, do things differently. We shouldn't see this as only humanitarian. This is a development. Drought happens everywhere. I used to live in California, and there was a big drought in California. That was multi-year drought. Nobody has died, and basically the only thing that was people couldn't water their lawns. The problem is that is the structural problems that we have in the region. Those, they have to be fixed. And we have to think outside the box, I say. And investment, we shouldn't look only as a humanitarian. We have to look at this as a development. So the silo also has to end, in my opinion. And we have to develop ideas. There are innovative ways. One of them is a risk transfer. As I was telling you, that restocking takes 5 years. You have droughts that are every 5-6 years. So hopefully, if we add anticipatory action, risk transfer, climate smart agriculture, drought resistant crops, hopefully we might end.
It's not easy, and just like you said, we're not really investing as much as we should, and I'm going to come back to that in regard to what now we need to do in terms of short-term and long-term investments that need to be put in place. Siddharth, if I come to you, when you look at the numbers as well, if we go back to these numbers, catastrophe levels are being looked at. You look at Somalia, South Sudan, are being categorized as some of the countries nearing catastrophe levels. And then you also get to the other numbers that have been shared as well. 23.6 million people in Ethiopia, 11.7 million in the Sudan, who have faced high levels of acute food insecurity. We are now looking at a situation that if we don't do something now, it probably might take longer to reverse. So how do we reverse the trend now, nick the situation in the bud, so we're not finding ourselves in a more, or probably a worse situation?
It's a very easy question. No, I'm going to really mirror Dr. Artan's words to a large extent. If you look at the drivers of the numbers you talked about, it's not just drought, it's not just conflict. It's underemployment, unemployment, there's gender dynamics, there's water. And none of this, and especially in WFP at least, we tend to look at this in silos, or we used to, but none of this is happening one after another. They're all happening at the same time. They're all happening in the same place. So you cannot be tailoring your responses as, we are going to do this, and that's going to sort it out. There has to be better integration. And to be frank, I think we have come a long way. When I say we, I mean all of us here. If you look back 10 years back, I think the silos were even worse. I think it's got better. We have ways to go. We have to improve. But I think that really is the answer, to put it in a nutshell. It is not about any one of us doing something more or doing something better. We have to link up with others. To give you an example, just within WFP, the organization I come from, and not to just because I have this experience, where we have linked our programs, where we have linked school feeding to asset creation, to gender, we see much better results. And to give you another example of Somalia, and certainly, please, I don't want to be misconstrued. Somalia, we have to do much more. There's lots of scope for improvement. But if you look 12 years ago when the first famine happened, it happened after 2 failed seasons. Today, there were 5.5 failed seasons. God forbid it hasn't gone into famine. That's because something has been done by all of us here and the government, of course. We have built-in resilience. There has been improvement. Lots of scope for improvement. But we have done something, and that something has been a result of all of us working together. So I think that is really the issue of, we have to link our work together. Otherwise, we're going to be coming back. Whatever we do is going to be nothing but Band-Aids. Thank you.
All right, and just briefly, if I might just follow up to that, do you think we can get to a point where we say we've achieved zero hunger?
Well, we're not going to achieve zero hunger if we don't do this. So we have to, basically. Thank you.
All right. Let me come to you now, Dr. Chimimba. Considering what you just heard from Siddharth, 7 million people in Ethiopia, or rather, we're talking about even the numbers in terms of livestock. In Ethiopia, that number is being put at 7 million animals, belonging to about 500 to 600,000 households, valued at $1.5 billion US. We are still looking at huge numbers in terms of losses, loss of livestock, loss of lives as well. And when we look at the prices of food generally at the international level, they might have come down at the international level, but that does not reflect what's happening in the region. And so the question is, how can we ensure that we are building sustainability, making sure that we have resilient and inclusive agri-food systems in the IGAD region, or the states categorized as IGAD member states?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. Yes, the numbers are staggering. I'll give you even more numbers, okay? Because we're looking at acute food insecurity today. There is also ongoing chronic food insecurity. Where in Africa we have 278 million people. So just slightly above the 258 million for acute food insecurity. And again, this region, the IGAD region, contributes more than 50% to that figure, which is extremely high, considering that the population of the IGAD countries vis-a-vis Africa is only about 20%. So I can only agree with what the colleagues have just said now in terms of how we can move forward to build resilience. The first thing I think that we need to build resilience is actually move to development. We have reversed the way we do things. And Artan, I think, mentioned it already. The emphasis on humanitarian work means that we are means that we're extinguishing fires instead of actually building development. So I think that's the first thing we need to do. First, the best way to build resilience is to make sure that we develop our countries. It requires political will. It requires many other things to do that. And then secondly, when a crisis is going to happen, like we already know, El Nino has started, right? We know. The good thing is that in this particular region, and thanks to Artan's team and others, we have consistently done excellent area warning. But that area warning does not exactly result in response, direct response. So we need really anticipatory action as quickly as possible to make sure that we can prevent any problems that might lead to famine. A good example is a study that we did in northern Kenya. The cost benefit of area warning there for anticipatory action was 3.5, was 3.5, the ratio. So it means that anticipatory action is good and then we also need immediately after that to respond effectively through either saving lives or saving livelihoods. To me, if we do that, we are probably going to be much more able to develop resilience here. I think there may be not many politicians here. I like talking to politicians because it is their job to make decisions. There is a politician. Then let him or her here. You have no political will to make a difference. And unless you do that, we are going to be in this same situation. And in my view, politicians should be very ashamed of the situation in which we are in East Africa. Thank you.
So much for that. And just to be sure, I hope that His Excellency Assad Mohammed, who is the State Minister for Agriculture and Irrigation in Somalia, falls in the category of politician because because then we wouldn't be able to have this conversation in the way that it should be had. And thank you, Dr. Firi, for putting that out. And in this case, does this mean that we are somewhere on the right track in terms of making sure that we mitigate future situations like what we currently are seeing?
Okay, let me, I think, I wish we were on the right track. We are not. But having said that, and this is where development and resilience works very well, I think my colleague from WFP just mentioned, the sort of drought that we have had over the past 5 seasons here, had it happened in the 1980s, there would have been much greater famine. So what it means is that we have developed, I think, mechanisms for communities to be more resilient. Governments tend to react a little bit faster. Donors tend to react a bit faster, but not exactly where we need to be. We need to reverse the proportion of support given for humanitarian vis-a-vis development. But the simple answer is that we are not on track to meet SDG 2 by 2030. We have failed to meet the African Union Malabo commitment of zero hunger by 2025. We need to accelerate. So we need all of us working together, starting with politicians, as I said, paving the way for providing the right environment for private investment and so on, to work to move the masses from where they are to where we want them to be. And then the development partners following the politicians' lead to make sure that we're moving to investments for development. So that then we would need emergency support only on occasional cases. So no, we are not on track. Thank you.
Just going by what Dr. Gulaid said and also what Sidharth has said and what you are saying, there needs to be a lot of work to be done from the political side of things to be able to move or get the ground moving in terms of mitigating many of these existing crises. And that brings me to Dr. Ahmed. When you look at what's happening I mean, it seems maybe there's a disconnect. Do you think our politicians are disconnected from what is on the ground? Listening to what Dr. Guleda said, what Siddharth has said, and also what Dr. Chimimba has said, or Dr. Firi has said, I mean, now when you look at the numbers, and then look at the reflection from the political side of things, I mean, do we really understand the magnanimity of this crisis? With the kind of work that you're doing with OWS Development Fund, maybe there's something that we're missing out on, and that needs to come out from the work that you're doing on the ground in Ethiopia.
Oh, thank you. And thanks to the doctor. I think the political will is an area that is very interesting. There is a mistrust between the donors, the government, and the non-state actors. And unless we solve that, I think this increasing or worsening situation will be there. In the last 25 years, either I was on the ground or was monitoring in a distance. For example, in Ethiopia, if you look at especially the last 2 years where we had more conflicts, severe drought, and a lot of a turnover of politics. When you work with the donors, whatever small they have, they want to trust that with non-state actors. And the government will have a less trust with the non-state actors too. So this mistrust, it's all based on, I think the donors are missing that the government is the policy makers. If they are not trusted, they will not have strong political will. And the non-actors like us, we might face regulatory issues, putting you pressure, and then you are not free to do what was right to do. So in order to get this all together, is all the partners, they need to trust each other and move forward. But as long as that is missing, whether we put on the politician that doesn't have the political will to solve these acute issues we have. If you walk into any sector, like if you go to education cluster, if you are specialized in food and only you stay in a food cluster, you might not even understand what's going on all because you just go in the food cluster. But if you go to education cluster, nutrition cluster, and then all you hear is that the government is not doing what they were supposed to do. And the government pushing back saying, you are not providing the resources needed, and the problem is you. So I think the situation we're facing is around those areas, and we need to really, in comprehensive way, to understand to solve out.
Right, but there has to be something that's working because it can't all be doom and gloom. I'm sure there's something that is working or is trying to work. Do you want to share a bit more on the part that's working?
I think as the brother said, I think if you look into history, 20 years back and today, where if you see two-season failure, then you are in the brink of famine. Now we had, last year, the worst drought in 40 years. And then we were not even close to famine. Because we have people, too many actors on the ground. And for example, we were operating in Ethiopia in the eastern part 80% of the time. 20 years ago, there were less than 10 NGOs, including international and national. Now you might find over 50 or close to 70 actors on the ground. So things are working because I think we are having more talented, skillful people on the ground. In eastern part of the country, Somali region, in the famine in 2000, we were getting nurses from Dublin, Scotland, and Germany. Now you might get even in the Wareda or the district as many as nurses you need. So there is a quick, rapid reforce available if the resource available. So I think a lot of things are working now.
But they could work better. All right, let me come to you, Dr. Mr. Nyakero. In Kenya today, we are seeing 5.4 million people facing high levels of acute food insecurity, and this is largely due to the impacts of the worst drought that has happened over the last 5 or so years. 5 consecutive poor rainy seasons. In fact, they're being categorized as failed rainy seasons. We have seen situations where, I think in some parts of Kenya, there are children who were born 5 years ago and they'd never seen what rain really looks like. And so when it rained this time around, these children were wondering, what's this water coming from up above in the sky? And with that in mind, it also goes to show you just how much this has affected different households along the way. And so what measures has and is Kenya taking to better the situation and make sure that this does not happen again? And can these measures as well be replicated in other IGAD member states?
Thank you. Maybe just a small correction. It is 5 seasons, not 5 years. Yeah, so the children that are seeing rains for the first time is maybe first time in 5 seasons. That's less than 3 years, maybe. However, the question is valid in the sense that we are facing severe and severer droughts as we've been moving from the 70s to the 80s until now. And the truth is some bit of work has gone into how drought is managed. And we would want to say that for Kenya, we have a functioning drought early warning system, which is able to churn out a drought early warning every month for each of the arid and semi-arid counties. And if this would be taken up by all stakeholders, including communities, then early action will be realized. I think the small bit of disconnect that exists now is at what point are we taking action when in actual sense we have early warning? You will find that even the communities, simple things like, I would call them simple from my perspective, like commercial offtake of livestock. It's a no-go area. Until they are desperate, that's the point at which they start thinking of where do we take these animals. But then if this would be taken up and then systems are strengthened in a manner that they are able to absorb an upsurge of livestock that is still in good body condition so that the producers get good prices for their livestock, then we will not be seeing the kind of losses that we eventually end up with. Again, even for the partners that come on board to respond, drought is not like any other hazard. Drought is slow onset. The moment you have shifted from normal phase to alert, then it calls for action. But then, generally in disaster risk management, there is a tendency to wait for the term emergency. So somebody will be sitting, waiting to hear drought emergency for them to respond. But then this drought emergency will have to wait until you are done with alert phase, and then alarm phase, and if you are unlucky, then you will get to emergency phase. All this time, the risk keeps increasing, because the more you delay, the more the numbers that you are likely to lose, the more the people you are likely to have suffering the impacts of drought. So, and unless we are able to, for purposes of dealing with the drought risk, being able to activate our responses, immediately we shift from normal to alert. And contingency plans for drought risk management have been developed in a manner that they resonate with the drought cycle, such that if you are at drought alert, then what are the proposed interventions that can be picked for that drought phase? And then if you are unlucky enough to progress to alarm, then the contingency plan also provides what priority interventions would be picked for that. And then, unfortunately, should you get to emergency, again, there are priority interventions that can be picked for that. But you see, by waiting until emergency, all these other interventions are already missed. Now, that is one side of the story. Dr. Ari here already mentioned that we could be looking at this in terms of putting off fires. Then how do we ensure that when the fire comes, we are aptly equipped and ready to deal with it? Then that is the development aspects. In this country, investments in resilience have been ongoing. Probably we require to invest a lot more, and that is true, but we haven't gotten to that extent. We require to see more investment in terms of capacities for irrigated production of crops and pasture. And then we need to see investments that avail water, because basically drought is about lack of water.
Right.
So if we are able to avail water, then we will be sorting out all this. And we have irrigation schemes that have been developed. Some are being expanded, even as we speak. And we are also looking at how we can entice, if I can use that term, more and more players to take an active role. And this now opens the door for even the private sector to take advantage of the opportunities that this drought, unfortunate as it is, as a hazard, presents to business. Because anytime we have a drought, then think of how many mouths will require to be fed during that drought.
So,
and then where is the food? How do we move this food from where it is to where the mouths are?
so looking at it as an opportunity.
Yes.
That can be harnessed.
Yes.
All right, Siddharth, let me come to you, and following also what Mr. Nyakeo has said, when you look at, for instance, what's happening or what's been happening in the Sudan, we've seen inflation rates go up, in fact, at levels never seen before. We've also seen that there has been a situation where, despite the fact that they've been prices going down elsewhere in the Sudan, it's been the opposite because of the conflict that's been happening there. And so are there any learnings that we can pick from other member states that maybe the rest of the member states that are going through crises can implement from a solutions point of view?
Thanks for that. Very happy by giving you non-doom and gloom answers. There's actually very good examples from this region dealing with migration, dealing with migrants, and so on. One of the best examples, not only for here but across, is Uganda. Uganda's policies on how to deal with incoming migrants and how to not just incoming and dealing with food security, but how to get them as part of the community, how to maximize fallow land, which is agricultural land which is not being used in northern Uganda, is now being used, better used rather, with giving migrants opportunities. How do you keep the unemployed youth, how do you harness that group of people? The 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds who are sitting in refugee camps, migration centers, things like this. So Uganda is a good example. Another great example coming from here, again across the region, I know Burundi for sure, I know Sudan, I think also Kenya, they've formed linkages with India and China, two of the large countries with the largest populations, with largest farmer populations, who do not have the opportunity anymore because of the population explosions there to really work on land. And they've been brought over for 1 year, 2 years, not permanently, just for a fixed amount of time, sent to areas in these countries where land has been underutilized. And there's a very symbiotic relationship here, because these farmers can go back with some money, and the land is now being better utilized for the country itself. So these are just two examples I can think of where their policies have come in, new ways of thinking, new arrangements to respond to situations and to maximize potential. Thank you.
Do we see a situation where policies are not really friendly to some of these implementations?
Well, I mean, the West is an example. The West have shut down their doors to migration now, right? So they've changed their policies, they've changed constitutions to stop it. God forbid it happens here to that extent. But definitely if things keep going worse, at some point countries will look at their own interests. So the answer is we don't know, but it could happen if it's not addressed. If numbers keep increasing, as you saw from 2016 to 2022, 2023, it's a 200% increase. If that keeps increasing, definitely policies will change too, unfortunately.
All right. Dr. Fury, let me come to you. We are seeing weather extremes as well, where they were not seen before. We're seeing many other countries now getting into crisis levels. Ethiopia, Kenya. I think Ethiopia is being mentioned in just about everything. Kenya, Somalia, and Uganda. We are now seeing this acute food insecurity now becoming a bigger problem generally among the countries. But what are some of the promising strategies from your perspective that you see might work, and what is it going to take to build the household resilience that we are all looking forward to seeing across the region?
Yes, I think the solutions are there. And generally well known. I think for me, the war in Ukraine is a wake-up call for most of the countries. The climate variability and so on is also a wake-up call. We have very good I think climate-smart technologies that, if adopted and particularly enhanced, then we would be in a position, I think, to build better resilience among households. The issue of soil health is very important. The emphasis so far in this region and elsewhere has been increasing the amount of fertilizer. While that is important, I think it is also good that analysts as well as government look at what those fertilizers do to the quality of the soil. So the question of balancing increased productivity now versus productivity increases later. So you require a bit more judicious use of very good soil health. We have problems still of post-harvest loss management, which is immense. Earlier on, you quoted the figure of 30 million, I think, people in need of food aid. In fact, the 4 million tons of food losses that we estimate happening in Eastern Africa would be enough to feed those 30 million people. So in which case, they would not need food aid at all. So when our FAO plus partner governments are working very closely on this issue of post-harvest loss management. Water control, water management is extremely important. And wherever it is done, I think we have seen major successes. Because when you have a drought, it means you lack water, basically. So if you can manage water resources judiciously by capturing water harvesting, but also, in our view, by making sure that pastoralists, in particular, access water at all times, including during droughts, I think we can make a big difference. I think we are now working towards a water conference here. I cannot remember the dates, I think it's probably September, to see how we can enhance our water resources in the region. So there are many examples of, I think, technologies that can make us move faster than we're moving now. But it requires scaling up. It requires a lot of resources, which we do not have at the moment. Even Kenya, which has done well in some respects, I think they need even more investments in some areas. Let me end with one example that I think has been very successful with our support, working with 4 countries in the Karamoja cluster to make sure that pastoralists can move from one jurisdiction to another very easily without conflict. And it requires conflict prevention methodologies and so on, which I think we have put in place. And this goes also with the Mandera cluster, covering 3 countries there. So if we can do a lot of work on conflict prevention, and I think we need to really extend that work. I'm talking of local communities here. Government to government is another matter. Thank you.
And now that you've put it that way, I guess, Dr. Ahmed, you can now probably chime in as well and talk to us about some of the solutions from the community, from the ground level up all the way to the decision-making level. What is it going to take for us to not only take anticipatory action, but also to build resilience so that we're able to protect or make our communities and our populations food secure?
Yeah, when it comes to resilience, and I think in the context of Ethiopia, our country is mentioned, as you said, in all of the places. Mm-hmm. In the last 5 years, I think the country has faced existential problems. I think the conflict of the north, intercommunal conflict, interregional conflicts, postural cross-border conflicts. And there is no much good news there. So to build a resilient program, we have a very, I think one of the numbers, Ethiopia IDP was declining, but at the same time we scored in 2001, the highest country that in 1 year scored 5 million IDPs within the country. And so now the importance of resilience program from the ground up, as well as these large IDPs within the country, which requires solutions, durable solutions. We need to parallel the two and connect. We have actors focusing more on durable solutions because the issue of IDPs is very hot in the country. And at the same time, the resiliency to cope with climate shocks, drought shocks, economic shocks, it's also there. And I think we have enough smart people that can put together the best, but if it's not bottom up, if you don't sit with the people that are the victims, and you don't listen to them how they want them to solve their problems, rather than us telling them this is how you're going to get out of the hole. I think there is a lot of good things going on. Now the donors and humanitarian organizations, development actors coming together to go to the people, sit with them, listen to them, and then start how this process. Yes, I think you might see a beautiful paperwork that you can sit in your room and just come up with a resilient program that really solves the problem on the ground. But when you really authentically, when you ask people how they want to get out of this, those programs based that genuine bottom-up, grown-up, I think works. But when we write bottom-up theoretically and tell the donors this is what we want to do, it usually doesn't work it. Because the people you want to help to cope with the shocks, we're not part of it.
Part of the process and did not have a chance to have their say. Mr. Nyakeo, and I know Dr. Artan, I want to give you the last word, which is why I'm saving the best for last. Mr. Nyakeo, when you look at the role of the government, NGOs, and the other stakeholders as well, Can we have a coordinated approach? Is it possible to have a coordinated approach? Because what Dr. Ahmed has said is quite critical, involving the communities in finding solutions that work for them from their perspective. Is there a way we can have a coordinated approach, briefly?
Yeah, I think it goes without saying. All players complement each other's efforts. And the expectation is any agency, any partner coming to be part of the process, of the implementation, of the response, comes in to complement whatever government is doing. And for effectiveness, to avoid wastage, duplications, and so on, then it's important to espouse a coordinated approach. And in this case, then, like in this country, we have coordination structures for drought risk management, both at national level and at county, and even all the way to sub-county level. The issue is, how do we, all of us, embrace this coordination framework? Because there are others that prefer to operate outside this, and then it becomes very difficult even to document what their contribution is, or to what extent they are able to support. But when they come in through a coordinated structure, then it's possible to know such and such entity will be working in a particular place, doing this for this period of time, so that anybody else coming to do a similar intervention, they can be directed elsewhere. Again, it is also possible to know at what time that particular entity's activities will no longer be running, so that somebody else can pick it at that point. The importance of coordination cannot be gainsaid. It's something that all of us have to buy into. The other bit is when you look at the resourcing, I think that could be the issue that probably leads to some of the lack of, the appearance of some sort of lack of coordination. Because whenever resources are involved, then declarations are expected. It is expected that you will say you are going to do this intervention and it will cost this much. Because at the end of the day, we'll have to assemble what it costed to deal with a drought crisis. And without that information coming through, then it becomes difficult. And for those that feel they don't want to avail that information for whatever reason, then they find the coordination arrangements a bit of a challenge for them. So essentially, let's look at it in terms of all going out there for the good of the public. Let's also embrace participation. Let's have the communities that we serve having a say in what we are coming to do. Thank you.
On a yes or no basis, do you share information with other countries, say the National Drought Management Authority of Kenya? Are there instances where you've shared information, say, with Ethiopia, with Somalia, with the other IGAD member states, or is this information only privy to Kenya?
I think our information is available. For instance, the NDMA website can be accessed by anybody. So in terms of access to information, none of our information is classified. So
there's no harmonized source of information for the IGAD states?
Okay, for us, Kenya is a member of IGAD, so whatever information IGAD requires from us, they will get.
It will fall in there. Okay, I like that. Thank you for making that clear. And now, Dr. Gulaid Artan, let me come to you. In many other situations and crises where we have seen so much happening globally, I guess the best example we're using in recent times is the COVID-19 pandemic. We have seen the use of technology to come in and play a huge role in trying to avert certain crises. Like the pandemic, we've seen technology being used in many other situations. And along the way, we are now asking the question, what role can technology play in helping us either predict and deal with anticipatory action and properly build resilience around the region in terms of climatic shocks? Is it possible, and the fact that, of course, you run IGAD's Climate Prediction and Application Center, tell us about the role of technology and how it can be used as well for the future.
Thank you. So actually, before I go to that question, let me, on the sharing of the data, Kenya shares data, and for the disaster, NDMA is part of the IGAD disaster risks clusters. In Ethiopia, there is a commission, Sudan Commission, Somalia, an agency. We have what we call TAC team, technical working group, and we share data through that. And every 4 months, there is a meeting. So I would like to go back to two things that were raised by the other colleagues on. One is that this region of ours, when you see data, you see Ethiopia or Kenya or so, the countries are not created equal. There is an area called, and Dr. Peter has raised it, area called borderlands. The underdevelopment, the resilience building is mostly needed at the border, in those areas that are on the borderlands. You don't see much of him in Nairobi, Kampala, Addis. That's where the most of the economic activities of the countries are taking place. So at IGAD, we are really, we're spearheading a program called, we're looking at things in a cluster mode, and there is raised the Karamoja cluster, there is the Turkana cluster, the Mandera one, the Kil one. So we're looking at how we can raise resilience on those borderland area. Another thing that I would like to raise is that actually our food security, situation food security, is not only climate dependent, but it's also conflict. And also the COVID had an effect, because basically there was restrictions to limit COVID, and those restrictions had an effect on the economy. So those macroeconomic things also have an effect. And conflict in the old days, we were looking only conflict within the region. Now this conflict in Ukraine, I didn't know most of our grains, oil, and fertilizer were coming from Russia and Ukraine before this conflict. So that also has and from IGAD point of view, we are really concerned on silencing the gunners, be within the countries or intra-countries. Now, coming to the role of technology. Data is essential for good forecast. From our side, we're actually working on leveraging satellite data. Data is far and few in between in the countries. One is sharing data. As of now, we archive around 44 stations that the countries share with us every 10 days. And last year we had an MOU with our member countries to increase that to 300 stations. But also we install in the countries satellite receiving stations in all the countries, so they can leverage their station data with satellite data. Also, we have one of the best cluster computing systems in the continent, and we have given actually access to our member countries. They have directories, they can run their models on our clusters. We are going also to artificial intelligence. We have a new project with Google and University of Oxford on how we can improve our forecast using artificial intelligence. So we're looking at different ways. Also, we're looking at low-cost weather stations. The problem is that a lot of weather stations that have been installed there they are not in use after a few years. With 3D printing, it's possible to produce a weather station only for $400. And we are advocating for that.
Okay, thank you so much for that. I'm going to take a question from the online participants who are, I think, about 100 of them.
Are